Alright, hello guys, glad to have you on board again today. You might have seen a similar video posted yesterday, though for those who've seen that V1, remember what was stated back then, that I would promise to redo and repost a V2 if there were too much wrong assumption in the V1 or incomplete stuff. And actually turns out it's been the case. I've explained back then that I had to rush this thing for the same reason that, well, these proposals in OSMOSIS, I've just a voting period of 5 days, which is pretty expeditive. And then in that perspective, I was kind of rushing my way into explaining the proposals so that you guys can cast your own vote with due diligence kind of notified. But the thing is that, well, it turns out that I've rushed my work way too much, and I'm pretty unhappy with the end result. So many people have brought back additional information to me, and I really thought it was worth really not just revamping some stuff, but redoing it all over again. So that's going to be a V2. Though for those who've seen V1, of course, I think V2 is going to be much more in-depth and enveloping all of the forthcoming things that I'll explain. Most of the conclusions still remain pretty much the same, but the arguments and the rhetoric in here will be far more detailed. So I think it's a win-win to have a look at V2. Well, if you haven't seen V1 at all, then V2 is just a total replacement of V1 in a much better format and a much greater depth. Without further ado, let's jump in. What we talk about is the set of proposals that we have in here in the OSMOSIS blockchain, which is basically proposal 486 right down to 484. And the thing is that those are 3 proposals, which kind of similar it is to the Atom 2.0 vote, but they've been learning the lessons from the Atom 2 drama back then, which is, well, basically people have been complaining about the fact that this was kind of an all-in-one proposal crafted by a limited set of individuals. They were just kind of fulfilling their own prophecies and pulling it in front of everyone else as a take it or leave it. Well, the thing is that it's been criticized that they should have split the actual vote into sub-votes so that people can agree or disagree on sub-parties of that bigger votes, and that is something that the OSMO community has been learning from. As we can see in here, this is a single proposal that has been split into 3 sub-proposals so that we can gather intermediate approval. These are text proposals, so normally they should be followed through with proper on-chain activation votes, though these are supposed to be like gathering feedback types of proposal. The thing is that you have to understand the set of 3, because that's really kind of a modification to the existing design of tokenomics, though this is the reason why I call it like OSMO 2.0 tokenomics. This is a clear changing of path and direction on both the emission side and the redistribution side, and we're going to explain everything about it looking at math. So the first of 3 proposals is lengthening the OSMO emission schedule, which is pretty damn easy to understand, pretty straightforward in here. It's provided by a set of curves, which I think, of course, takes some time to read it all. I wish I had done it earlier myself, which I didn't. The thing is that I've rushed myself into the different math of the different supply schedules that are proposed. Number one thing is to this, which means this is the current schedule that we're in, okay, which has an asymptotic curve that reduces out to $1 billion token emission, pretty much like the Bitcoin halving stands to 21 million without ever reaching it. That's the same story in here. There will never be any more than 1 billion token to the current emission schedule. And the thing is that they're proposing a change of this. So the change will be set by 2 factors, which can be either voted separately or combined. Though the vote in here doesn't give us the opportunity, it's more like, do you agree on doing both? And then probably will be separate sets of votes to apply them on chain. The thing is that proposal number 1, if we read the proposal stuff, is to say, well, we're going to create a halving immediately, like at the next update of OSMOSIS, we're going to add up another spice on top of it, which is going to be a halving, which is basically we're going to halve inflation and cut it by half. So the thing is that this is a one-of-a-kind event. There's not going to be any other halving that back then, and we keep on having the same schedule of every year thirdening. This is the emission curve of OSMOSIS, okay, which is approximately the way it is today. We kind of have an inflation lifespan which is starting and lasting for approximately 10 years, which means after 10 years the inflation is so marginable that it barely is existent. And on the prior year, we've got that absolutely exponential curve, which means the half-life, which is what we count as half of the token being emitted, is reached out prior to 2 years, which is a very, very short time of early absolute magistrous inflation period. Though we're past that early inflation and we're starting to be in the second era of osmosis, which is past the half-life, and we're just saying maybe this 10-year lifespan isn't going to be enough and would be eventually smart to have a longer release schedule to give us an open door for a longer term adjustment. Remember that when there is no more inflation, there is no more dynamic supply emission, that gives us the opportunity to readjust monetary policy. Remember that inflation is of course politicized most of the time in a stupid way. Inflation isn't good or bad, it mostly is a redistribution stuff, which means it mostly depends on what you do with it. If you distribute 90% of the reward to 1% of the population, of course what you have is monetary concentration, and that's the problem we're in fiat systems. But despite that, well, we're in crypto, so we know where every token is going, we know what happens with it, so we can monitor everything. So inflation can definitely be a worthy factor in here. It depends on what you do with it. Though the proposed emission schedule modification is doing two things. It's far greater lengthening the duration of the overall emission cycle, which expands it to roughly an additional 5 years, which to me is a plus because it gives us the opportunity to adjust the monetary policy onward on a longer period of time, which is always a win-win situation. Leaves for open door can only be positive. Well, the thing is that if we were just doing this, creating a halving and maintaining the current emission schedule, we would be doing the red curve, which means by slashing half of the inflation today and maintaining third earnings, well, the asymptotical curve will actually change and shift its actual anchor point. The measurements in here give us the precise number, which I should have shown you the other day, which is basically 780 million tokens, sorry, which is 22% reduced emission expectation out of the current 1 billion tokens expected. Okay, so that's the thing. There's also discounted cash flows in here because the duration being amplified to a reachable maximum over 15 years approximately instead of 10 years will modify discounted cash flows. But despite that, well, that also means, well, there's no bigger changes. But if we go for this thing, that's an immediate change in the monetary policy that should be increasing immediately more than 22% of the token prices, because there is going to be the clear expectation of 22% less token being emitted. So this is pretty much a very bad solution because it increases volatility and changes of and radical changes in kind of step sequence, which is never a good stuff. On the opposite hand, well, they offered the solution to do a one-off halving and slow the next thirdening by doubling their time scales. Basically, each and every time we were doing halvings, each and every 365 epochs, which is basically a year, an epoch being 1 day. Though the thing is that they offer to double that amount. At the next halving, we will still have the next one at the due date, and we will then have the next one 2 years later instead of 1 year, and keep on doing that mechanism onward. That gives us the yellow curve, which seems to be to me like a good compromise because it still has the asymptotical response of 980 million tokens, which is roughly the same as the 1 billion that we had before. It just extends the relative duration of that emission schedule. The second thing that we need to assess into this is what effect does it have? Well, the thing is that as we create a shift between the expected current monetary policy and the new proposed one, if it gets adopted, the market always cares to the first derivative. Basically, we're going to take the rate of change between the two, the difference between those things, and we're going to measure, and we're going to take and measure the rate of change, aka, is it increasing? Is that distance increasing or decreasing? Okay, the first derivative. So if we measure that, you would see that actually the maximum pinpoint is going to be around 3 to 4 years from now. So if we do that thing, it's going to be reducing the net emission against the expected thing for the next 3 to 4 years. And then it's going to start to peak, which means there's going to be a positive lifting effect supporting the OSMO prices because less token circulating. But then, of course, as market traded derivatives, this effect will start to dampen and reverse slowly over the course of the latest years until it just go back to where it should have been anyway. Okay, so there's going to be a positive effect on prices for 3 to 4 years. That's the immediate response there is for such a monetary policy change. Okay, Of course, it also impacts, like we stated, discounted cash flows, but this is nothing burger, and I'm not going to go into too many details in here. Okay, so assess the fact that in terms of compromises, this one seems to be like definitely the most favorable one, and that's the one proposed by this vote in here, so I'm definitely agreed with that one. It's a good choice. It gives us an open door for a longer duration of emission schedule, and it is a good compromise that should help lift some of the token emissions off the market for the next 3 years, which should have a positive impact on OSMO prices. The second thing is, therefore, the major question you should ask yourself as you touch the emission schedule. That's great. That touches and modify inflation, can lift the token prices. We've seen that. But the number one consequence is, and the most important thing to talk about is, where the fuck do we put that money into? Because that's the number one concern about inflation. Inflation can be a very good or destructive process. It depends on where you distribute the money. Okay? So in here, there is a breakdown on the situation we're in and the situation we're headed to. So clear stuff is just we're listing the where we're in. Easy way to monitor that is to have a look at the blockchain itself in the Minscan blockchain explorer. You've got the parameters of the chains in here, in which you should see what are the current distribution modules parameters. The distribution model gives 25% of the inflation to staking rewards, 5% to community pool, 45% to pool incentive, and 25% to developer rewards. All right, we know that's exactly it. The thing is that, well, we have an actual modification that has been done, and I actually wasn't even aware of that, to be honest. I just learned that one. The thing is that, well, the staking has been 25%, still the same thing, but there has been an agreement to redistribute a significant portion of the pool incentives back to community pool, which has totally fucked up the expected redistribution mechanism into doing these effective yields. 36% of the inflation was actually fooling the community pool instead of fooling the pool incentives, which have been falling right back down to 30.5%. So it's been a political choice, motivated, of course, by multiple things that were unexpected back then, not to mention Terra Luna was the responsible factor for this. We had to replenish the community pool that has been emptied because of those unforeseeable events, and therefore we've decided to use the pool incentive. As being in the bear market, fueling the pool incentive wasn't necessarily a factor, and we had to have a compromise. Remember that when you redistribute somewhere, you have to take someone money elsewhere. So this is really a factor of what is the political motivation. If you want to increase the reward somewhere, you have to take him all off for someone else. So in here, it's been pool incentive sacrificed for the replenishing of community pool. The thing is that right now the community pool has been replenished significantly. We can see that by looking at assets in here and scrolling down into the OSMO tokens. Give it a second. All right, so we've got the supply breakdown, and as you can see now, the distribution model has fulfilled the community pool by 78 million or 79 million token, which is somewhere around 14 to 15% of the the actual token supply. So this is kind of a significant share in here. That is very, very important for you to understand that. Now that the community pool is well replenished and all of the fixes have been done to compensate for potential losses of the aftermath of different hacks and the Terra Luna full of shit stuff, well, the thing is that, of course, now is a due time to review the distribution of those models again. And definitely, I would say this is a requirement. Though this is the proposition they made, 50% to staking, though I would personally have said, well, we're probably going to roll back to the original staking proposals, which means we're going to go back to this model, 45% pool incentive. Number one goal for OSMOSIS is to attract liquidity, because that's the number one selling pitch of OSMOSIS, being a liquidity pool chain. Though it would seem logically enough to attract liquidity incentives more than staking. But, well, that's not what we have. So if there is a change in the redistribution, there's a political shift in the actual blockchain vision, which is, once again, can be politically motivated and understandable, but if you do go along with that proposal, you have to understand the political motivation of shifting the actual token model. Okay, remember that if you want to make winners, you're gonna have to make losers. So the question is, do we run the math to understand what it all goes? And this is where I had to go for a V2, because I was stupid enough not to roll it down and say, yeah, actually they've been running the math that I was needed to go on fully describing this thing. I was stupid enough to actually try to do it myself, because Well, I was expected to do it, I just didn't have the time. But I was so stupid enough to not even scroll down to see that they did it themselves. So here it is, okay? We've got the supply breakdown, supply modeling of the tokenomics with the proposed modifications. So I've put it down back to the way it is today, which means we have that halving event, which is reducing inflation by 50%. We've got the staking distribution that is moved away from existing 25% right up to 50%. They've been done pretty good job in here. Superfluid discount, we're going to talk about that later. The pool incentive distribution that was currently 45% is scrolled down to 20%. And the previous share redistributing 70% of pool incentive into the actual community pool are now set to 0, all right? And developer rewards remain at 25%. And here is the supply breakdown of what it actually does. So if we keep it that way, if we just modify the redistribution factors, well, as we've seen, staking is going from 25 to 50% as inflation goes by slashing by half. So you divide by 2 and you multiply by 2 on the other hand, aka no modification. Staking is purely being absolutely not modified. The number of tokens dedicated to staking, securing the chain, is actually exactly the same. So it's a very significant political move. We're going to slash inflation, but security isn't a compromise. I like that, but once again, political move. If you want to incentivize security, that means someone has to pay for it. And we've seen that it is going to be pool incentive who's going to be the loser because there is 25% diminishing reversed inflation to pool incentive out of the already severely diminished $75,000 because most of the tokens were redistributed to the community pool due to the redistribution of 75% or 70% of the actual pool incentive toward the community pool. So we already had a deplenished furniture for pool incentive due to the redistribution, but now it's even worse. That means the situation is going to be even 26% worse than it is currently. And we'll see that on the metrics. There is a significant liquidity problem in OSMOSIS, which should be addressed, and for this, to me, seems like a pretty bad compromise to make. In order to stabilize security, you're going to have to compromise on liquidity over an already existing compromise, which is, well, to me, pretty bad choice. Well, community pool, like we stated, is the biggest loser because, of course, it was the net gainer back then and now is going to be severely reduced. So totally normal. This is the biggest loser. But we can see in here that there is also another big loser, which is this. The developer rewards still remain the same. Remember that anyhow and anyway, the end game of the supply curve is the same, which means if we tend toward the same kind of end game result, there is still the same amount of token distributed. It's just that the staking rewards, the rewards for the devs will be the same one 15 years from now. The difference is just the rate at which they receive their token. They will still get the same 25% share. They're just taking it on a longer period of time. So nothing changes for the devs. It has to be assessed in here. Very important to understand. So the devs are not losing money. They're just taking the same amount, just they have longer vestings or some kind because they will receive that inflation in a longer period of time. But the end game is the same amount in their pockets. All right. So that's one thing. We understand the winners and the losers. The developer rewards are not the losers because they're still going to get the same amount of money in a longer period of time. And anyway, as the half-life of these token emission has been more than less than 2 years, that means the devs have already taken more than half of what they will receive over 15 years. So basically, they're already full with cash and they don't really need additional money. So they're not losing anything. Who's the biggest loser? The community pool. But of course, like we stated, it has to be. It was a temporary patch. Now it's no longer necessary. So of course, the community pool is the big loser. The question is, why the heck do we sacrifice even more pool incentive on an already deplenished system? It's really, to me, a critical political choice just to say, yeah, we're not changing anything on security. Though in order to boost the actual token economics by reducing inflation, someone has to lose. And in here we said, yeah, we're going to make pool incentive to lose. It sounds odd and stupid to me because the #1 role of the OSMOSIS blockchain is to attract liquidity. So to me, the 45% initial for pool incentive was not just a move. It was a design meant to attract liquidity in the ecosystem. And it's definitely has been a successful move because if you have a look at it, in the overall period of time when we had those incentives, you can see that, boy, this has definitely been attracting liquidity. Though, of course, you would say back then we were in a bull market and stuff like that. Well, just have a look in denominated token. You will see that despite the rise in Atom, despite the rise in Osmo, the overall liquidity was significantly increased with those incentives. What you can see here is Luna followed by no more incentive. What you see is that in a token denominated term, well, there is no growth in the incentive though there is no demand for the liquidity pools. On the opposite end, we've also seen that the actual one of the rewards of liquidity pool providing is to get the swap fees. So in here you would see the volumes have tanked like crazy. So there's one thing we can tell for sure. Of course, the bear market was a response for some of this as well, but we can see that removing pool incentive has an immediate effect on removing attractivity for liquid providers. It also, of course, means that less liquidity depth in the pools means less trading activity. Of course, it's still a tricky correlation to make because we're in a bear market, and some would just argue to say we're in a deplenished kind of volume attractivity because, well, this is just a bear market. Well, like I would say, I think the bear market is over. We've got signs of this, but you don't see any uptick in the liquidity right now, and neither in the volume traded, which is still the sign to me that, yeah, liquidity incentive should potentially be required in order to restart the heart pumping blood in the Osmo ecosystem. So I would say politically motivating, reducing the token supply to pump the token price at the expense of liquidity pools expenditure isn't necessarily a smart choice. It is a political move, so there are probably reasons behind that, but you have to understand that, well, I personally wouldn't have done such a move. And I think, well, there are rational reasons to say this is a questionable political decision. I would like those making those choices to explain why they're doing this, because I certainly don't understand any of it. Though the other moves, which means it's very great because we've got a full mathematical breakdown, and I like that. The thing is that, well, we can see what it's been doing. If we do it that way, which means we just readjust the metrics, here's what happens. We've got the staking yields being measured, okay, and you've got the net staking yields off inflation being actually at a net positive 8%, coming out of a current negative 4%, which means current net emission today compared to the actual staking yield is negative, which means someone who's stake in the actual Osmo chain is being diluted 4% a year. That's the way it is, okay? Though this proposal will change that up to 8% net positive reward, which is kind of great because we both have the Kiskel effect of reducing net emission. That's what we do with reducing inflation. And as we maintain the exact same share of staking rewards, by reducing inflation, we've got that nice pump in net reward. Coming from minus 4% to 8% is a significant shift, okay, in terms of delta. And here we've got a plus 12% delta. That means, once again, in order to pump up and to prop up that staking yield, someone's going to have to lose. Though the biggest loser, like we've seen, is the current replenishing of the community pool, but not just it. It's also come along with liquidity yield rewards. The current model in here, I think, is kind of misleading because, well, it tells you basically, oh, we're going to get a 9% net LP reward compared to the 8.20Y. Yeah, that's great. That means there is an incentive to go for liquidity yield. The thing is that, well, of course, you have to understand the mechanics of providing liquidity, which is basically going into an XY pair in which X generally is Osmo and Y is another token. And the number one risk for liquidity providing is that you're going to get an impermanent loss risk, which means as these are 50-50 balance pools, and they will maintain the 50-50 balance, as the price of these tokens vary one against each other, the volatility of that price movement can create a total imbalance, which means when you exit the liquidity providing, you will recover different weights of X and Y tokens, and as their price would have moved in the meantime, there could be an impermanent loss, which means if you have just holded these two sets of tokens, you would have made more profits than providing liquidity for them. So the impermanent loss is a significant risk for a liquidity provider. There are advanced models that can calculate it. I'm not going to go into the details. There are more professional risk limitations models for this, but the TLDR in here is that the number one impactful factor is the volatility of XY tokens, basically. So it's hard to say, but the higher the volatility of the tokens, of course, the higher the risk of impermanent loss, which means higher the risk means higher the reward should be to take that risk. If I am going to LP on OSMOSIS, I want my LP rewards to significantly outpace the net reward I would get on a staking yield, okay? Though as we also reduce the circulating staking yield, we get a net diluted stuff of 9% against 9.33. So as you can see, this is kind of negligible. As a risk manager to myself, and I haven't learned that a couple of weeks like full of shit guys in YouTube, okay, I know the shit I'm talking about. I've been doing this for years, and I do it very professionally. Though the thing is that, well, if I've got the same risk for different rewards, or the same rewards for different risks, then I'm just going to take the lowest risks. It's just the same way it goes, okay? If I take 9% on both cases, if I can measure the risks of staking, which are pretty easy, we've made an entire video about that, the risk of providing your tokens and delegating them directly to a validator is next close to zero risk, because as long as you choose a trustworthy validator, which all of them are, or at least most of them are, well, there is no other chance you're going to get staked, you're going to get slashed. And the professional validators will provide slashing insurance anyway. So there is no risk to be losing money in here, but to choose a bad validator. So most of them probably won't be, so there's no really risks out there. So that means there is a risk-free 9% rewards. So how the heck am I going to take the complex mathematical risk of impermanent loss, and this is not the only one, by just taking a 9%, and also assess that this net 9% is accounting for the nice thing. This is agglomerating all the liquidity providing rewards. The swap fees, and they've been taking weighting average swap fees, which means, well, if you delegate to the pool that makes most of the average swap fees, then good for you. If you take on the less providing one, well, those numbers will go down. So that means this is the average yield you could get. So you'd rather like to delegate to more yielding pools and having a higher incentive APR. Once again, these things are adjusted by governance, which means these things can vary over time. So there are multiple variables in here in the risk accounting for liquidity providing, where on the other hand, for quite similar average rewards, I got a risk-free delegation. Though it's a no-brainer to me. It's a no-brainer. I'm definitely going to go there and never consider going there. So the current model in here I would say is pretty bad, because number one rule for OSMOSIS token is to be used for the number one purpose of this fucking chain, which isn't providing the highest standard of security, but actually helping attracting liquidity. So I think the number one case for Osmo should be attracting fucking liquidity. And what we can see in here is that this business model simply does the other way around. It's attracting people to stake instead of delegate. And that's a bad choice to me. We should do it the opposite way around. So this business model and this tokenomics to me is just going 180 degrees. It's just trying to pump the Osmo price at the expense of attracting liquidity in the pools, which is supposed to be the number one fucking job of OSMOSIS. Remember one thing, we're in an app chain thesis, which means there will be competition, and if someone else is better at attracting liquidity, well, OSMOSIS will be left empty with no use cases. So I've always said, just like some people have complained, yeah, Atom could die. Yeah, Atom could die, just like Osmo. Just don't get it as granted. Nothing is ever to be granted. There will be multiple competitions, DEXs coming along the way, the SUIs, and alike, which will provide some more advanced techniques like decentralized order books, which means limit orders, matching engines, and stuff like that. These are much more advanced market maker system than just the automated AMMs that are provided by OSMOSIS. So OSMOSIS provides some cool stuff with the superfluid staking, not to mention forthcoming interfluid staking and stuff like that. So don't get me wrong, I love OSMOSIS. But the current change in policy in here is kind of a definitely risky move, because it's moving the Osmo token utility away from attracting liquidity and incentivize bringing liquidity into the pools to put more depth, which reduces the volatility. So the bigger the depth of the pool, the lower the liquidity there is, the lower the volatility, which is a very, very net positive. So to me, the positive feedback loop of OSMOSIS is to have depth in the pools instead of kind of doing it the opposite way around by pulling Osmos out of the pools by going into a risk-free direct staking. Though to me, that's a bad choice. Why is it that way? Well, of course, it is, because if the model was just like that, it would be stupid. Though these guys have been coming along with a smart way to compensate for it, it's to say we're going to move the superfluid discount. In order to go down this path, I'm going to have to explain what that is, because that's basically what the third proposal is asking for, which is therefore reducing the risk factor. Okay? Though what is this risk factor? You have to understand just the TLDR of what actually is superfluid staking. It's basically, well, you have a liquidity providing pool in which you've got the token Y versus the token X. Token X is, of course, OSMOSIS. Though the thing is that OSMOSIS said, we're fueling the pools with this, which means what we want in OSMOSIS is most of the pools to be token X, aka OSMOSIS, versus token Y, and token Z, and token etc. You got the point, okay? And what we do is that we allow net exchange of token Y to token Z by the intermediary swap of Osmo, which means the token Y is exchanged for Osmo, which is then ported into the other pool, and then the user takes away the token Z. And there's been a swap, which means there has been an intermediary facilitating liquid stuff, which is the Osmo token. The osmosis is like the intermediate fluid that facilitates interswap interchange swaps. This is really great because that means we can have native token exchange by the intermediate use of osmosis to facilitate pool aggregation. Instead of having to create a cash region pools and then a cash Cosmos hub, a cash Yumi, we can just create one Akash Osmo pool and exchange to any other token because every other token is traded against Osmo as well. So this is kind of fluidifying the actual share and liquidity shares. So that's the business model, very understandable. Then the second factor has been, well, though we've got all those Osmos locked into liquidity pools in the early stages of osmosis, the actual LP incentive was crazy fucking high, so everybody was putting their Osmo in LP shares. This is why we had those magic TVLs, because there was huge incentive to people using it. Though the risk of impermanent loss, despite early stage tokenomics and stuff like that, high inflation on the Akashans and like, well, there was tremendous risk of volatility and therefore impermanent loss. But no one gave a fuck because the APR was like threefold. It was absolute mind-boggling rewards. So people were flushed with cash due to the early absolute mind-boggling high early years of inflation. Remember that the half-life of osmosis was less than 2 years. So most of half the rewards on the entire lifespan of osmosis has been spent already. So that's really a significant early inflation. Okay, though the thing is that in order to change the monetary policy, because there are no stupid guys, osmosis guys said, yeah, we're going to have to take care of our security at some point, and all of this untapped liquidity in the actual pools could actually be used to create kind of a double Kiskel effect, which is basically we can provide security with those untapped liquidity tokens. They basically stand still in the liquidity pool, they're everywhere, and we could use some of these tokens to be collateral for slashing. Remember how security on consensus for proof of stake is established with BFT, Tendermint, aka Comet BFT stuff running in osmosis is. Basically, the tokens remain normally in the holder's wallet. They're just delegated to a validator, which has the intermediary consensus rights, which means if the validator misbehaves, the consensus decides to slash some of the collateral, which means the tokens that are still in the depositor's wallet will be slashed because it agreed to delegate the validation rights to the validator who's been misbehaving or going downtime and stuff like that. Though the necessary functioning of proof-of-stake BFTs is basically the collateral for slashing needs to be liquid. It needs to be available to be slashed at every moment because it is a slashing command that has to be executed immediately. So, yeah, how can we do that? If we ever have to slash the superfluid collateral, but if that token is actually in a liquid pool, then that means I'm gonna bring some volatility to the pool. Though the reason why means that if we ever have to slash the collateralized superfluid stake tokens, that it introduces a negative feedback loop, which means it's going to increase the volatility in the LP share of that token in which the collateral needs to be slashed, which will probably create volatility on the Osmo token, which will increase the impermanent loss on every other pool, and that's kind of, as you can see, a very destructive feedback loop. So you definitely don't want that to happen. That's the reason why we want to guarantee that we're really using untapped or risk-free liquid provided tokens that can't be traded the next second, all right? So the reason why this is prior to the collateral risk of volatility, then that means regarding the volatility of the pair, we're gonna have to have a safety net to avoid the impossible way in which some tokens would have to be slashed, but these tokens will be unavailable because someone took them off. If for whatever reason someone is feeling or destroying the pool and taking all the liquidity out while still creating an attack on the consensus in the same time, and therefore should be responsible for collateral being destroyed for such attack. But if such collateral is already taken off the chain by swapping out away into Akash, for example, there is a big problem. Though of course there are lots of safety procedures in osmosis that prevent that from happening. But the thing is that we still need to see how these things are processed over time because we haven't seen quite a volatility move recently. The thing is that if we look at the history of osmosis for the latest few months, yet it's been a bear market, yes, but the thing is that both the volumes and the liquidity and the volatility in the pool has been significantly reduced. But the thing is that we might be on the verge of restarting a new bull market, so changing the market state And at that moment, using that risk limitation factor as a collateral to make that overall system work, I think it's a dangerous choice to make. Because using the superfluid discount as a monetary aggregate to re-rate all of these things, because as you can see, if I move it out to 25%, then we have different results. We've got a net staking yield of 6.38%. Out of circulate is taking in 7%, but let's take this one as a comparison. So 6.38 out of 12. In here, we start to have a delta of 6%, which means you have a risk-free 6%, okay? And you're going to have a risk of impermanent loss with a net plus 6% reward. So you're starting to get a net reward for the risks you take. Well, to be honest, regarding the complexity and professionalism it takes to fully get rid of impermanent loss, well, a 6% shift certainly doesn't make it. It means, well, even professional market makers will certainly not be there to add for 6% of a distance. So this is my job, okay? I know how professional works, and I can definitely tell you that a 6% spread isn't enough for professional market makers to go along this path. Moreover, what's very dangerous in here and what is, to me, very misleading is that the assumption is fed to you that all of the liquidity pools will have that 12% incentive, which is definitely not the fucking case. Remember that out of these 12%, there is 12% incentives, and those incentives are mostly coming with the superfluid staking, which means there is a double Kiskel effect in here. Most of the incentives are targeted to superfluid staking pools, and if you therefore are a pool which is not in the superfluid gang, and you have less incentive, you will have below average incentives, so far below 12%, and you're certainly not going to get the 7 Kiskel effect. Though you are 7% out, you don't have the 12%, you're only left with swap fees, which means 4% plus eventually some incentives if you're lucky enough to get some. Well, that means you're not even competing with the staking anymore. So for pools that are out of the superfluid gang, this is still absolutely unprofitable to attract market makers and professional liquidity providers. It will not make it. These guys, if they ever get to deal with Osmo, they will go for the safest fucking yield. They will not use LP tokens for OSMOSIS token they might hold. They will just hold the Osmo token and do nothing, or at least not going down to a risk taking, which it doesn't provide a significant delta out of the risk-free stuff. Though, of course, this is more professional stuff to understand, is that if you take risk, you need to be compensated for it. Though how much you weight it is a professional measurement stuff. I give you in here kind of finger in the nose out of these things because I can do it almost naturally in here. I would like to run the math more perfectly, but I can definitely tell you that the bare minimum in here would be a 12% shift. So you need to have a 10 to 12% difference in here in order to attract professional market makers into providing liquidity. So you have to understand that out of the current system which we're in, there is still a 6 to 7% lack to get the professionals onboarded. Though, of course, one would argue that we can shift, of course, by having swap fees severely increasing if for whatever reason market makers were taking the risk of showing up and therefore magically bringing depth into this market and therefore having the volume pumping right back up with, for example, another bull market. But like I said, I don't say this overall business model is bad. All I'm saying it's taking quite a lot of things, quite a lot of assumption as being granted already. Like the market makers are going to show up even though they have to take risks before the actual market liquidity is improved again. Because remember, the swap volatility, the volatility of your swap, the spread is mostly related to the liquidity provided in the pool. So to me, it's just things being done the other way around. To me, Osmo should first of all pay attention to reliquidifying its ecosystem to attract more professional market makers by bringing in more depth. And as a second Kiskel effect, we should see the bull market reactivating those swaps in the OSMOSIS blockchain, improving therefore the double Kiskel effect, which should rise this number to probably something a bit higher than that, somewhere like 6 to 7% fees gathered. And at that point, like I said, I think the incentives are not enough. My personal assumption is we shouldn't be moving the superfluid discount now because we lack of available data points and history on the true risk management of superfluid staking. We've experienced that in a bear market environment with very limited swap and very limited volatility in the pools themselves. So to be honest, as we're going to change the market state, moving along with that cursor of risk by increasing the risk taken in an unforeseen environment, I remember the good old days in which Osmo couldn't be destroyed. Osmo was the killer app of Cosmos. It's going to destroy the Cosmos hub and stuff like that. And then, boom. Something unexpected showed up. Though I know by experience of these fucking markets, far beyond cryptos and this nice bubble we're in, the risk always comes from the areas which you least expect it to come from. So it will happen. And if you increase the risk cursors just for the profits of reducing inflation and having to prop up the token, well, like we said, if we want to change inflation, that means someone has to lose. In here, if we want no one to lose, and if we want this perfect scenario in which everybody gains, well, someone still has to lose. That's the risk caution. The caution of risk that we have with those superfluid discounts, this is where this model is making the assumption to create something which is still, to me, an insufficient delta. And it's also not making the assumption that most of this delta existing today is nulled if for whatever reason you have to deal with somebody that is not a superfluid staking pool. So this is really like aligning incentives to superfluid friends, and the rest of the market, well, go fuck yourself. If you want to have liquidity, you're gonna have to bring a lot more incentive to compensate the liquid providers for the impermanent loss risk there is. So you're gonna have to bring all the incentives yourself and deal with your own liquidity, do your own liquidity bootstraps and like that. Well, to be honest, there's already a lot of things to do for a blockchain to launch in the Cosmos. You're gonna have to bootstrap your own security validator set. You have to bootstrap your own decentralized autonomous organization, governance system. Well, there's plenty of things to take care of. And more importantly, you got to work on your fucking product updates. Because remember, it's not just launching and taking money. It's launching and improving constantly to remain in the constant battle of distributed horizontal technology. So the thing is that there are plenty of things to take care of. And forcing projects to have to take care of their own liquidity bootstrap, which is already hell of a fucking mess, well, I thought all along that this was OSMOSIS' business model to make it easier for projects to liquid bootstrap in order to get their token listed and traded freely on an AMM DEX. Well, to me, that was the selling point of OSMOSIS. What we have today is clearly setting a change for this. It's, yes, we still have that business model for those we think are worthy enough of superfluid staking. But to be honest, there's not going to be a single token that will launch with superfluid staking on day one, which means you're still left with go fuck yourself and figure out a way to get to stabilize your liquidity pools yourself. Once you get stabilized enough, we can add the nice key-school effect of superfluid staking, which will far deepen the liquidity you have in your token and reduce the volatility and stuff like that. You can get the nice key-school effect if you are superfluid approved. Yeah, once again, this is a political trade-off. You have to be part of the gang to be and to have the superfluid staking. Otherwise, it's really like the Wild West out there, and just you have to handle this on your own, which I thought all along was the go-to business strategy for OSMOSIS, to help other around by providing bootstrapping liquidity services and stuff like that. Well, like I said, this will be left as a whole to me, which means someone has to step in. Though I hope it's not going to be a competitor. It's going to provide easier go-to-market access for liquidity provisions for other Cosmos chains. Otherwise, well, OSMOSIS is going to lose tremendous market shares. Of course, I think OSMOSIS guys are smart enough to know that, which to me leaves an open door for a discussion. I would like to see some of the grant programs of the nicely replenished community pool to fund projects to actually do two things. Though if this proposal were to pass, I would say there are two things that need to come along with it. The first one is, I think there should be a grant program for someone to build a protocol-based system to facilitate and semi-automate liquidity bootstrapping by creating semi-automated market-making strategy to reduce volatility on the early stages of the token supplies, to avoid pumps and dump schemes and price manipulation or emptying the pools. This is a professional job. Market-making liquidity bootstrap is a fucking complicated job to make. It requires professional people doing it, who knows how to handle this, and I definitely think using the incentives of the community pool to spend people to create these automated tools, like a protocol to easier liquid bootstrap on Cosmos blockchain to deploy on Osmosis, that would be the selling pitch to compensate for the fact that the current tokenomics says it otherwise. It says, just handle it on your own, guys. All right? Just figure it out. Well, like I said, to me, it's a pretty bad selling point, though I wish there will be a compensation for it. A nice message sent that would be like, yeah, we're not just leaving you guys alone out there. We're going to give you some protocol-based system to help you around that. Of course, we're going to help you around sustaining the prime efforts. If you succeed in launching a good liquidity and if you align with Osmosis incentive, you're going to be lucky enough to be superfluid granted. And then you're going to be having the nice Key-Skull effect, which could make Osmosis the center of liquidity that I see it to be in the future. But today, what I have in here is a huge risk assumption, huge risk taking on things that could potentially turn well, but could also be a very disastrous effect if for whatever reason a competitor was offering a better go-to-market strategy for liquidity deployments, which would be the killing app for Osmosis. And we said there are multiple other services deploying sooner in the general interchain ecosystem, Suis and others. So you'd rather like to be cautious with that move, Osmosis guys. I know you're smart enough to listen, so please spend some of these nice replenished community pool funds to fund and compensate for the lack of liquidity bootstrap support. That's one thing. The second thing, boy, I really think we need a lot more in-depth analysis of superfluid staking a discount, which means to me it requires a professional risk manager making a fully trustworthy analysis, meaning breaking some fucking math in here of derivative risk measurements on the volatility and all of the other metrics that account for risk limitation to make sure that the 25% is sustainable for every chain. Because the bigger problem to me is that, well, if we have a look at this, well, we know that some pools do have liquid staking, superfluid staking, but the thing is that it is a limited set of pools that are beneficiarying this, and to me, they're different pools under the same hood, which means everyone is having the same 25% cushion, which I think is dangerous because to me, this should be adjusted pool by pool. The superfluid discount should be different on Atom Osmo pool because the Atom Osmo relative risk of impermanent loss and stuff like that isn't the same. The volatility risk isn't the same. The volatility of Osmo Atom trading isn't the same as, for example, Osmo or Cash. Therefore, how the heck could we have a one side to fit them all on a superfluid discount? So to me, switching that thing isn't a good choice. If there was a compromise to make, I would say it has to be done on a pool-by-pool basis if you want to do it like that. A more cautious approach would be hiring a professional risk manager to run the fucking math and make sure this doesn't end up in the slightest of all possibility to ever end up in the situation we've described prior to that, which is some token requiring to be slashed but being available because the liquidity isn't there enough. Or to require those tokens to be slashed, which will amplify greatly the volatility in the pool. Though these things can happen because it will destabilize the core thesis of Osmosis. You can't compromise on security, so it may and it can't happen ever that a slashable collateral isn't available. That isn't something that can happen, and if it ever happens, someone will see it because you can't hide it on chain, and if it ever happens, that's an absolute no-go immediate for every professional market managers. If this ever happens, all of the professionals will get the message, get the fuck away from here, go to a competitor. So this just can't happen. You can't compromise on security, okay? Though that means the only compromise that can be made is the volatility in the pools. And if the pools are increased volatility because of slashable events, because we took too much risk by reducing the safety cushion, well, to be honest, I think it isn't a smart choice to make. And I would like to have some maths backing the claim, studying all of the slashable events, the historic volatility, and making sure that the math never crosses ever. Because remember one thing, it may not cross for a long period of time, but if it crosses just one day, it's disastrous longer term effect. It must never happen. And be sure to listen carefully. if you are smart ass thinking, yeah, I can just run some simple math and say, oh, it's not going to cross over, we're safe. Have you thought about Luna? No, you didn't. And have you seen the disastrous consequences? It's exactly the same thing if you play around with risks without caution. So I would say playing under risk caution in here, not a smart move without the math, professional math backing it. What we wanted here is not a 0.111% chance for this to occur. It's a fucking net zero. All right, I hope you understand that. Professional risk managers are always handling the risk that way. I hope OSMOSIS will learn from people who are actually doing this as a job. So like I said, I don't know everything, but I know certain things, and I would like to say in here there are a couple of things I disagree with it. The superfluid discount isn't a good mechanism to me. It should be carefully measured before we actually move that lever, because once we move it, it's a one-way trip to heaven. And I hope we're never going to be driven to hell because of this. And history has told me that the path to hell is generally led by absolutely good by absolutely good prophecies in the first place. So the road to hell is pretty dangerous. And guys, you want to have some nice effects. I would be smarter than that to say, well, I see some cautious move required in here. And moving fast and preemptively in here by adjusting this lever to just readjust the overall thing, well, to me, it's a dangerous move. Though I would like for this to be at least postponed until we get some more visibility onto this. Otherwise, well, like I said, it is kind of a business model that could work, but it's on the expense of the risk taking in here. Though I would like to see this risk reduced to reduce just the risks, because boy, the harder the risks you take, you can gather the rewards. But if it's end up being creating the problem just one time, the consequences will be far more devastating than just the potential rewards of pumping the token price that we could get for the next 3 years. Though, to be honest, I like the idea behind that tokenomics. I definitely think it's required. Definitely it's headed in the right direction. I just think that some compromises and trade-offs made in here should be more carefully assessed. And I do this and say this as a professional risk manager. I know the shit I'm talking about, and I think this requires more thorough analysis before going fully deployed on chain. That doesn't mean I don't want this to happen. I just would like to have more carefully crafted security measurements. And on the opposite end, I think there is kind of a political shift in here, which to me means if I had to shift that thing, I would do it that way, okay? I wouldn't touch that, or go for 40% if you want to, okay? But slashing half is kind of not letting enough of a cushion, okay? Though I would say go easy on that one and eventually say we have that lever to increase more and more as we get more risk limitation by data points. Second thing you could do, like we said, use the community pool and get someone to build a protocol which will real-time adjust the superfluid discount. And you're going to get the best value extracted of superfluid discount with math backing the claims. And you will get a pool-by-pool superfluid discount, which will vary over time. And that's one of the smartest way to me to get this model in action. If you want to reduce that thing, get it algorithmically predicted by someone who knows the shit it's talking about, someone who knows how to measure those risks, and create the automatic balance in here by calculating derivative measurements of volatility and all other risk factors that could be impacting in this risk system. If you have that, I would be more confident to say, okay, you can move that lever safely, all right? On the opposite hand, well, if you do that, like we stated, I think anyhow and anyway that some other metrics should be changed, okay? So the thing is that right now, I think that the community pool incentives, oh, sorry about that. Sorry. I think that the staking distribution should be lowered to 40%, okay? And the pool incentive distribution rising up to 30%. Because by doing this, guess what happens? The staking yield still is positive, so this is good. We're coming out of negative yield to positive yield, which is good. That means if you want a risk-free reward in the OSMOSIS blockchain, you can still stake the tokens for a risk-free 2.37%. Okay, good for it. And on the opposite hand, we incentivize severely the yield depositing by having a 16, which means in here you got the 12% delta, which I was mentioning earlier. This is how, by slightly adjusting the metrics and not necessarily acting on superfluid discount or not too much about it, you've got a system that actually works a lot better. Like I said, building economic model is something that I do as a job as well for some other project in the Cosmos ecosystem, so I think I know the shit I'm talking about in here as well. I'm not perfect, but I think, how to balance these things. This is how I would have personally done this. I think this was a much more appropriate weighting without touching the dangerous level of superfluid discount, while still providing the necessary delta between staking yield and net LP yield, which will incentivize users to get their tokens in the fucking pools, which should be the #1 focus of Osmosis chain. Okay, incentivizing security over liquidity providing isn't the business of Osmo, and therefore I think it's a stupid, or at least not well balanced political choice to make. The one that I just showed you in here seems to me like a much smarter balance, because it creates the incentive to get the tokens in the liquid pools instead of just going for risk-free staking on chain. All right. I hope you understand now. I hope I have been making some kind of positive positive feedback into this. It's not just outrageously criticizing and saying this is bad, but just say, yeah, these are the risks that are taken. These are the compromises. These are the trade-offs. And to me, I think a more balanced approach could be done by just slightly changing some of the metrics proposed out here. So I hope the Osmo guys will listen to this. Because I think it's worth listening to. I think my model is better than the one that is proposed in here. I think objectively, I try to explain why. So I hope this thing will be relayed to ears that will eventually be smart enough to listen to it. Of course, I don't have the true answer to this. The chain will decide, and like I've always said, I'm a democratic person, and if the general public accept the current metrics as they are, understanding the consequences of it by taking the risks on the superfluid risk factor and stuff like that, to get a not so badly balanced stuff, which is still good to me. I mean, the way it is today, it works out. I just think we can strike a better balance with less risk taking, with the same effects in the end, by just adjusting different levers. That's the way it is. That's it for today, guys. 55 minutes long video. It's pretty damn long, but at least I have a very thorough explanation of everything. There is no shade or areas anymore. I think now everybody understands the comings and goings of that proposal so that you can vote on every possible knowledge available out there. That being said, thank you guys. If you think that video has to be forwarded to some ears at the Osmosis, then feel free to tag them. I'll be happy to have their feedback on that. There might be some parameters there that I'm not very aware of, and some of these political choices might be actually fully well decided. I would like to know more about that. Otherwise, I think external from those political decisions, I think a monetary decision could be more appropriate by just readjusting some of the levers to the numbers that I proposed in here. That being said, bye guys.